finish our reading from the scriptures at this moment, and let's next consider our subordinate standards, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church's Confession of Faith, which is rooted in the Westminster Confession of Faith. And we're looking at I believe that should be the 25th chapter of the Confession. Maybe not. We're on the subject of marriage, and today we'll consider the last two sections of that chapter on what I will call a lawful divorce. We'll read sections 5 and 6. Adultery or fornication committed after a contract, being detected before marriage, giveth just occasion to the innocent party to dissolve that contract. In the case of adultery after marriage, it is lawful for the innocent party to sue out the divorce, and after the divorce to marry another, as if the offending party were dead. Although the corruption of man be such as is apt to study arguments unduly to put asunder those whom God hath joined together in marriage, yet nothing but adultery, or such willful desertion as can in no way be remedied by the church or civil magistrate, is the cause sufficient of dissolving the bond of marriage, wherein a public and orderly course of proceeding is to be observed, and the persons concerned in it not left to their own wills and discretion in their own case. So here we consider not only the fact that God has joined husband and wife together in marriage, but sometimes because we live in a fallen and sinful world, and parties who are joined in marriage are sinners, and sin wreaks its havoc on that marriage, there comes a point in time where it may be possible to consider a divorce. Now, I put it in those terms in that when we consider divorce and the occasions of a divorce, I think it's apparent from the confession here that a divorce is not necessarily required. It is permissible, but not necessarily required. In other words, if you should be the innocent victim in an act of adultery or what have you, that act of adultery does not require you then to divorce your partner. It may be that you will consider forgiving your partner, working through the issues that have arisen within your marriage, and seeking reconciliation. Now, that needs to be a careful, deliberative process. It would be helpful to have the church involved in that, including your pastor and elders. But in any case, there can be an effort to seek reconciliation in spite of the sin that has occurred within the marriage relationship. So I think as we go along here, we'll see that a divorce is not something which is demanded or absolutely necessary, but there are occasions where it might be prudent, right, and good, and you're certainly free to seek a divorce under certain conditions. Another aspect to marriage that we see here in the confession is here in this 5th section, the first clause there, adultery committed after a contract. We often have very romantic ideas about marriage, and two young people come together in feelings of love and fellowship and companionship and wishing to spend their life together, and all that is true and obviously desirable in a marriage relationship. But at bottom, you have to recall that a marriage is a contract, almost like a business arrangement, where partners pledge to be in a relationship to each other over time. And they take upon themselves certain responsibilities and obligations within that contract. And that's not a very romantic way of thinking of marriage. You've got to fulfill the terms of your contract here, and stipulation number 14 in subsection 3b, you need to do this and that. Not very romantic. But it's helpful to be reminded of that, because sometimes when the feelings go in a marriage relationship, when you're not feeling particularly loving towards your spouse, then you need to remind yourself that you've got a contract. You have an obligation, a duty to love your spouse, to care for that partner. And even when you're not feeling especially happy about the relationship, you need to do what you can to maintain that relationship and fulfill your obligations before God. Remember, you took vows before God and before other witnesses to love, cherish, and obey, however the terms are, within your relationship. So it has the nature of a contract. And that reminds us that there's a formality to it. We don't just kind of begin to shack up and live together. There is an arrangement, a due arrangement with the state involvement, certifying the appropriateness of the marriage, and the church approving the relationship as well. So that there are formal aspects to a marriage relationship. It's not just the romantic feeling of coming together and living happily ever after. There are some very basic legal aspects to it that we need to bear in mind. That includes property and the disposition of property. I have a friend who has been married for some time, and they're having differences about the use of their property, and money becomes at times in marriage a significant issue. So you have to remember, you have a contract, an obligation to be united to each other. So next we consider the time of an act, and you have first the arrangement made prior to the marriage, what we call our engagement period, and the confession indicates, which is I think rather obvious, that should adultery or fornication be committed after this contract has been formed. In other words, the pledge of marriage is kind of a contract at that point. The formal ceremony certifies it all, but there's already a kind of an informal agreement in the contract there. But if there's been an act of adultery or fornication after the contract and before the marriage, in that period of time, the individual who is considering marriage has the right and freedom to cancel that arrangement, cancel that marriage arrangement. So there is a just occasion for the innocent party to dissolve that contract, no longer under obligation to observe those kinds of terms or the promises that have been made. After marriage, we get into the next section, it's certainly lawful for the innocent party to sue out a divorce. So it becomes much more significant now. It's not just merely agreed to go your different ways. Now that you've been married, now you have to go through the legal steps of pursuing a divorce. And the innocent party is permitted, it's lawful for them to sue out a divorce. And after the divorce, to marry another as if the offending party were dead. Two things to consider here. What is it that constitutes adultery or some sort of arrangement where it cannot be remedied by the church or the state? There are differences of opinion on that, and I want to get into that in just a moment. But basically, I think the sexual act is what's considered there. And I don't want to get too far into considering that much. Now, the individual who seeks a divorce, having been the innocent party of divorce, the confession says, is now able and free to marry another, marry again. There are some who would suggest that you're joined together by God for marriage forever, and you can never marry again. What God has joined together, let not man separate. But the confession indicates that there are occasions when you may sue for a divorce, gain a divorce, and remarry again. Now, again, there are certain qualifications to that, which we'll consider here in just a moment. But note that there is the possibility of remarriage, and as though the offending party were dead. Their actions have broken the covenant, broken that relationship, broken that contract. It's no longer valid, no longer binding, and now you are free to pursue another relationship. Okay, the sixth section has to do with the fact that many of us, when we see that if you will, that green grass on the other side, then consider, well, what can I do to get there? What is it that qualifies for getting myself free of this relationship that I might not be happy about? And marriage relationships sometimes are very, very difficult. Sometimes there's hostility within the relationship, verbal abuse, distance between the partners, and they don't hardly even talk to each other within the relationship. There can be some very, very difficult relationships. And so there's an interest in finding a motivation for finding a way out of that relationship. The scriptures give us two grounds for escaping a marriage, and that is nothing but adultery or such willful desertion as can in no way be remedied by the church or civil magistrate. Now, adultery, we understand for the most part. This desertion gets to be a little bit more tricky. What constitutes desertion? Is it just leaving the home and no longer being apart? Or is it staying within the home but being emotionally detached from that person and having nothing to do with that person, just for financial purposes, being still in the same home, but really living completely separate lives? Does that qualify as a willful desertion? Is a failure to support one's spouse financially an example of a willful desertion? If it's willful, then one might consider that. Sometimes it's just poverty comes upon someone, but in any case, these are things which are difficult to discern. But the one thing you should bear in mind is that you should not make the decision on your own to seek that divorce. You might feel you have reasons for that, but you should seek the assistance of your church and or the civil magistrate. The civil magistrate, of course, will try to perhaps resolve the differences within the marriage before it gets to a divorce. Same with the church. The elders can come alongside that married couple and counsel them. The pastor can give them counsel as to how to deal with their differences and how to try to work towards solutions. Sometimes it's helpful to have a third party involved in trying to work through the differences there. But there comes a point in time when the differences cannot be remedied by the church or by the civil magistrate. In other words, the church addresses the situation, may even bring about discipline of one particular member, and may even excommunicate that member, and still no response, no repentance, no return to the marriage relationship. That's a situation where it cannot be any further remedied by the church, and you may be free to marry again. Finally, again, it should be an orderly course of procedure. You should not be left to your own to decide whether that's the case. A lot of times that's what happens. One particular party within the marriage relationship just determines, I'm out of here, and it's really, really hard to change that once that occurs. But the exhortation here is to be patient and to seek the help of your church and perhaps even lawyers as well. We'll finish there.